Hey Richard, my tune was spot on and I still hurt my motor. Well, the average air fuel was right, but the individual cylinder air fuel was not. Hello everybody, I'm Richard Holdner, and as always, welcome to the channel. Today we're talking about something that's very, very important, and that is air fuel distribution. That's right. Now, normally when we tune a motor, we put something up on the dyno. What we'll do is put our O2 sensor in the exhaust, usually on one side or the other, meaning that we're monitoring like 4 of the cylinders and getting an average number. And I'm going to show you why that doesn't always work. So what we normally do is we'll run the motor, we'll tune it accordingly, and we'll put it in a safe air fuel, in a nice safe air fuel range, and then we'll start adding timing because we know that it's safe. Well, I'm here to tell you it's not always safe. Just because it has the right air fuel in those 4 cylinders as an average doesn't mean that every cylinder in the motor has that air fuel ratio. And I'm going to show you in the way that we do that is we've hooked up 8 O2 sensors, 1 in each one of the primary tubes of our headers. We're taking individual cylinder readings, and I'm going to show you why this average number that we normally tune with isn't accurate, and how you can definitely hurt your motor when one cylinder is bad, because all it takes is for it to be too lean for too long, and it's too bad. Let's jump right in here in part 1. We're going to take a look at our naturally aspirated combinations using both a single plane and dual plane intake manifold. I'm going to follow this up in part 2, where we add boost from a very cool Vortex supercharger and a blow-through carburetor. Is the single plane and dual plane different? And also, will it be different when we add some boost? Okay guys, as I said in the introduction, I'm going to show you why it's possible for you to blow up the motor even when your air fuel looks like it's correct, because it might not be correct in every cylinder, even if we're taking a reading on either one side or the other of the motor. Each individual cylinder may be wildly different. I'm going to show you exactly what I'm talking about. We've got a 4.8 liter. It has JE dome pistons, otherwise it's stock. On the bottom end, it has TrickFlow 205 heads. It had a Brian Tooley Racing Stage 1. This was a positive displacement blower cam. It was a 610 586 lift, a 223 238 degree duration split, and a really wide 120 degree lobe separation angle. We ran this thing carbureted, and I ran it with a single plane and a dual plane, and then we ran it with a single plane and a dual plane under boost, and we monitored the air fuel in all of the cylinders to find out what the distribution was like. NA on both of the intake manifolds, and then supercharged on both of the intake manifolds to see if there's any change on all of those different combinations. So run with a 750 carburetor. This thing also had an MSD ignition controller, an ATI dampener on it, and we had a set of 1 3/4 QTP headers on it. And so we ran it first with a Performer RPM dual plane intake manifold and a 750 Holley, and our combination produced 440 horsepower at 7,000 RPM and 352 foot-pounds at 5,800 RPM. Here's what happened when we replaced the single plane, or replaced the dual plane, with a single plane Victor Jr. It's showing that it made a little bit less power, and I have to, in full disclosure, we didn't spend a whole bunch of time tuning this thing, and you'll see in the air fuel curves what I'm talking about. But the dual plane was around 13-to-1 up there, and the single plane was like 11-6. The problem, and we'll see this in the air fuel curve, is trying to tune one specific spot on the RPM range. You affect all the rest of it. But what I want you to take a look at is, this is kind of typical of single planes and dual planes. The dual plane makes basically a better power curve, in this case all the way through essentially. But if you notice below 5,000 RPM, the single plane has a dramatic drop in power, when we always see this on a single plane dual plane. The dual plane makes more low speed power, and then at some point the single plane usually crosses over, and probably would do that on this if we were doing a little more mindful in our tuning. But now let's take a look at the air fuel curves associated with both of these combinations, and then we can take a look at the individual air fuel curves on our NA combination, and then jump right over to boosted. Okay, we've taken a look at the power difference between our single plane and dual plane. Pretty normal stuff. The single plane makes less power down low, and then usually makes more power at top, and I'll show you why it didn't do that here. In fact, because I know that that's going to come in, I'm going to go ahead and move myself probably out of the way here. So this is the air fuel curve offered by the dual plane with our 750 Holley. It started out down here at around 12-to-1, dipped down to 11.75, and at its leanest point was up here at 13.2 out out near the power peak. Now, obviously, it would be nice if we could have this thing be nice and flat all the way across at whatever our desired airfield curve was, and we can do that with fuel injection. It's a little more difficult with carburation to adjust it just at one spot and not have it affect the other. But this is the airfield curve offered on the test that we did, and here's what the airfield curve looks like when we ran the single plane manifold. So we started out a little bit leaner, 12.75, and then that dipped down to 11.4 down here, and you can see that the airfield curve, like I was talking about, 11.6 out here at the power peak. Probably why the dual or the single plane didn't make as much peak power as the dual plane did, and probably would have. And we normally have that happen. Usually there's a crossover between the two. The dual plane makes more power down low at some point, and it could be, when I say low, it could be below 6,000 RPM, and then above that, the single plane usually makes a little bit more power. But what I want you to note is take a look at these airfield curves. Both of these are well within the normal range. 11.5 is still okay on an NA motor, 12.7 is okay, 11.7 and 13.2 might be a little bit on the lean side, but all this is in the normal range. And if you look at these airfield curves, you think, well, nothing is really going to happen to this motor if I run this motor. It's going to run just fine. And we made lots and lots of pulls on it. But let's take a look now at what happens in the individual cylinders, and we can kind of compare them with the numbers we're seeing right here. Okay, previously I illustrated the airfield curve offered by the dual plane intake manifold and our 750 Holley carburetor on our naturally aspirated version. It ranged, if you remember, from 11.9 to 13.2, all in the safe range, and that basically is taking an O2 sensor reading in the collector from one side or the other of the motor. Basically, we're taking an average of 4 cylinders, and it didn't range very much. It all looks safe and happy, but when we look at all the cylinders, we see a dramatically different story. And here, if we take a look at our range, we have at our richest point 10.5, where our richest point was 11.9 before when we were taking the average, and our leanest point here at around 5,000 or 5,100 RPM, 15.8 to 1. So dramatically leaner than our 13.2 that we saw, and we saw that basically at the top of the RPM range. So it's not even occurring at the same RPM range. So what I'm saying is, if we test the individual cylinders, the airfield curve offered by the individual cylinders with this intake manifold are dramatically different than we're seeing just taking an average reading in the header collector. And this is why, even if you tune this thing, running the O2 sensor the way that we normally do it, if we tuned it into a safe air fuel curve, you might still hurt the motor. Because if you're running at wide open throttle for very long at 15.8 to 1, in that cylinder, you can still hurt that particular cylinder because it's too lean. Now let's take a look, and we'll go ahead and get rid of our dual plane. Let's look at the same thing on our single plane. This is our naturally aspirated single plane. It's actually a little bit better maybe than the dual plane. It just starts out very lean. So 2 of the cylinders up here at around 3,600 RPM are starting out at 15.5. And you'll remember, if you don't remember, I'll remind you, if we looked at the air fuel curve, again, taken in the header collector as an average of 4 cylinders, we saw when we took our, air fuel, the way that we were tuning, it ranged from mid-11s up to 12.7 on the single plane. Well, here we have 2 cylinders that are as lean as 15.5. Now they come back down into a normal range, but even the cylinder out here at the power peak is 13.5. So that's still way too lean in that one cylinder. It starts out way too lean and continues to be way too lean. And so even though all the rest of them down here are in the 10s and 11s, which is very, very safe, we have one that's 11.7 or 11.8, but we have one of them that's 13.5 at wide open throttle where you're making a big power. And this is why, even when you're tuning and reading an air fuel meter in individual cylinders, it can still be wrong. Okay, guys, so real quickly, what is our takeaway from all of this? Well, it looks like neither the single plane or the dual plane have really optimum airfield distribution for all the cylinders. As we saw, it looked like the single plane was kind of trending. It started out lean and then started trending rich, but we still saw a fairly big disparity. I mean, we saw changes from 10.5 to 1 to 15.3 to 1, in individual cylinders, and the same thing on the dual plane from 10.6 up to 15.8. And we saw that not only did they change, only did the distribution change based on the intake design, but it also did it over the RPM range for the individual intake design. So we have lots of things. Now, how do we cure this? I honestly don't think that we can cure a problem that's inherent in the intake manifold with any kind of carburetor. I don't think a better carburetor is the answer. I just think this is inherent in the intake design. The one way to cure it, obviously, would be to put electronic fuel injection on it and then still have to go in and do individual cylinder tuning to make sure that they're all even. I have a video up on that. You guys can check that out. I'm curious now what happens in part 2 when we add the Vortex supercharger to it and we're going to be blowing through a CSU dedicated blow-through carburetor. Will blowing the fuel into the intake manifold help or hurt airfield distribution for the different intake manifolds? Let me know what you think in the comments. But I'm Mr. Holdner. Please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. More cool distribution testing like this. Part 2 coming up.